So, ladies and gentlemen, nice to be with you. It has been asked to me to speak about non-intended consequences of regulation, especially after COVID crisis. And the question is what we have forgotten since 1989. A lot we've forgotten. You know, as I did, as I do, that modern states have always the volunteer to grow more and more. And they take each opportunity to do it. They did it with after September 11th, 2001. They did it after subprime and Lehman Brothers crisis in 2008. They are doing it with terrorism as a good pretext to grow, doing it with ecology as a better pretext to grow, and so on. And today, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is a very good pretext for states to grow. And we will try to describe the process. First of all, the area of our freedoms is more and more reduced. In many countries with pandemic, and probably particularly in France, the state declared itself at war with the virus. Why? Because it was the way to institute a state of exception. And in this respect, the state multiplied measures to interfere in the life of families, in the organization of companies, to control the freedom to come and go for everybody, to control the work of employees and how they work in the office, to limit trade, to decide on our health care, to hinder the exercise of worship, and so on. And we can say today, 1 year after the beginning of the pandemic, that the state has crossed a threshold it never dared to cross before. It dictates what must be done in open space, meeting rooms, traffic areas, canteens, changing rooms. It limits the number of people able to have lunch together in France, yes, at home, in our homes, and so on. The fact is that freedom becomes the exception. And as you probably agree, as I do, we can say that a free country is one in which everything that is not forbidden is allowed. And what a totalitarian state is, it is one in which everything that is not allowed is forbidden. Unfortunately, I am afraid the virus leads us to be in the second definition. Second point, this exceptional way, this state of exception becomes the ordinary, particularly about public expenses. Exceptional expenses become so usual as do the infinite constraints that accompany them all the day. So that the abnormal becomes normality. And the abnormal is accepted as such by the citizen as something normal. An example is the way citizens were asking themselves for more confinements, for example. It is what a very good French author from the 19th century, La Boétie, called voluntary servitude. Voluntary servitude was established in France more than ever, which presupposes that the subjects we are become accustomed to the demands of the prince and had made it their petty happiness. More, the exceptional expenses we are living for have sunk their bed deeply, so deeply that they will have difficulty finding their previous bed after the pandemic. All of us know that it is infinitely more difficult to reduce expenditures than to increase it, and especially when the state don't pay for, because it is only paid by new laws. They hope never to have to repay them. In France today, as an example, according to official figures from INSEE, which is a state agency for statistic data and economics data. So in France, public spending accounted in 2020 for 2/3 of the GDP, exactly 66.8% of GDP. And it will probably stay at a very high level for a lot of time. What does it mean? Just that the scale of the increase in expenditure has not only a quantitative effect, but we are afraid that it will have a qualitative effect, which transforms the nature of society. Why? Because a certain threshold of public expenditure and levies, which France may have reached, beyond such a threshold, the country becomes collectivist. And we probably have the worst to attend. Because in the same way, not only each nation is becoming more collectivist, but it is at the European level that it happens. The third point is to say that Europe centralized more and more. And the pandemic is a pretext to centralize. With the agreement of the nation, of the European nations. Why? Because to free themselves from any national responsibility, European states are organizing more and more rescue plans to the European level. And it is just an additional technocratic layer that will undermine the operational nature of decision and dilute responsibilities more and more. And you have some example with decision to purchase vaccines, which have been so bad managed. Decision about health instructions, and so on and so on. It means that the Commission is interfering in the policy of national states, and it is interfering to submit the states to new rules by itself. The European Commission is trying to subject the granting of European aid to various and varied conditions that represent new interference in the state life, in the lives of states, just on the contrary of subsidiarity rules, which have been the basic rules of Europe when it has been founded. And because Europeans centralize, states are centralizing too. A good example is Germany. Each state takes the opportunity of the sanitary crisis, and it is exactly what Germany is trying to do against the decision of the states, of the region. A fourth point is that during this centralization, accompanying this centralization, there is more and more public people governing the life of other people, and states distributing aid to companies particularly, and people too, do it distribute these new heads more and more on condition of the respect of some rules about ecology, social and financial rules, and so on and so. And the state is blackmailing people, and particularly companies. If you don't respect, says the state, if you don't respect these new rules, ecological, social, financial, and so on and so, you will not get ahead. Just blackmail. The state lends, or more, the state lends or guarantee some loans to companies. And of course, so many companies are in or will be in so huge difficulties after the pandemic that they will not be able to reimburse those loans or else. And then the state will size their capital and try to manage them. The steering of company by this way is and will be transferred progressively to a new technocracy, just as like and through an insidious way. It is why I say that it is something like a collectivization without nationalization. A fifth point I would underpoint is that through this way, the growing of states and technocracy and bureaucracy, there is a risk of corruption which is increasing. Why? Because the growth of bureaucracy feeds naturally the channels of corruption. When it needs and takes stamps to get a decision, there are always bureaucrats ready to bargain those stamps. It is corruption. The more civil servants there are, the more regulation there are, since civil servants have nothing more pressing than produce regulation in order to prove themselves useful. And the more civil servants there are, and the more regulation there are, the greater the risk of corruption is. And once more, the risk has been proven in Germany, where several members of parliament and a minister were caught red-handed in mask trafficking. It means, it is my sixth point, I have only 7. It is a sixth point. It means that we are in front of a serious risk of regression. Why regression? Because in the same way, the more civil servants there are, the more they want to spend, the more the cost of the state increases, the heavier the burden of taxpayer is, and the more society is discouraged from entrepreneurship, and then the poorer the country becomes. Something like a vicious circle that only ends, usually, in a breakdown or collapse. To get some example about France, it is not only pandemic, of course, but it is the spirit of the new society. What happened in France? Wolves are back in countryside with the insecurity they cause. Wind turbines are rising like the windmills in the Middle Age. Cars are being banned in favor of bicycle. Tolls will be set up at regional borders in France for EV trucks and will, of course, impede the trade. I said like Middle Age, not exactly, because it is worse than Middle Age. It is something like maybe a new totalitarianism, and it is my last point, seventh one. Because through all those decisions, bureaucratic decisions, Politicians, of course, believe they are doing good. In fact, they want to make our good, but in their view, not in ours. They decide for us. They do even better it by making people want what politicians want. Very insidious.